All emphasis in American prisons is about punishment, retribution, and disparagement, and almost none is about rehabilitation. Conrad Black. As children, many of us were taught that everyone deserves a second chance, and this should be the case especially with prison inmates. As a high school student with an incarcerated family member, I am concerned at the efforts that jails and prisons around the United States are making to ensure an inmate receives some form of rehabilitation. Prisons should serve not as incarceration sites, but as rehabilitation centers, and in order for this to be possible, the government should provide more funding. In order to explain why prisons should serve as rehabilitation centers instead of incarceration sites, I will address three main points. First, how current inmates are not receiving the necessary resources to be able to rehabilitate while incarcerated. Second, why inmates continue to relapse back into their bad habits/tendencies or prison. And finally, why the government should provide more funding in order to reform prisons into rehabilitation centers. Current inmates are not receiving the necessary resources to be able to rehabilitate while incarcerated. Oftentimes, programs or resources already in place do not succeed. According to the Legislative Analyst Office website article, Improving In-Prison Rehabilitation Programs, written in December 2017 by Jonathan Peterson, a fiscal and policy analyst, and Anita Lee, a principal fiscal and policy analyst, CDCR, or California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's in-prison rehabilitation programs have several shortcomings. CDCR programs often fall short in adhering to the above three key principles for reducing recidivism. Existing rehabilitation programs are falling short of their purpose, and now we will move on to how rehabilitation programs aren't offered in all prisons. Not all prisons incorporate or offer rehabilitation programs. In an article written by Brian Berkey, PhD, published by Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania in August 2017, the economic impact of prisons' rehabilitation programs. Berkey states, while almost all federal prisons have alcohol and drug rehabilitation programs, more than a quarter of all state prisons do not provide prisoners with alcohol and drug dependency counseling and awareness programs. Prisons across the nation do not all offer rehabilitation programs, and the ones that are offered are limited. Now that we have discussed how current inmates are not receiving the necessary resources to be able to rehabilitate while incarcerated, let's move on to inmates returning to prison after their release. Inmates continue to relapse back into their bad habits/tendencies or prison. There is a large recidivism rate in the United States. World Population Review published an article in April 2020, Recidivism Rates by State 2020, which states, according to the National Institute of Justice, almost 44% of criminals released returned before the end of their first year out of prison. In 2005, about 68 of 405,000 prisoners were arrested for a new crime within 3 years, and 77% were arrested within 5 years. Upon release, inmates go back to prison at an extremely high rate, and this rate will only continue to grow. And this rate is only increasing due to the lack of rehabilitation, resources, and programs. Next, we will be discussing the lack of skills inmates possess to do well once released. Inmates lack the proper skills to succeed once they are released. Writers Goche Tejeng and Haleon Abadir wrote an article in 2018 published by Art and Social Sciences Journal, exploring factors contributing to recidivism, the case of Desi and Waldeia Correctional Centers, in which they state, the most plausible reason to explain the relatively high recidivism rate among released offenders were centered on the offenders' educational illiteracy, lack of vocational job skills, and lack of interpretational skills or criminal history. Due to the lack of rehabilitation opportunities, inmates relapse back into prison. Now that we understand why inmates relapse back into prison, let's move on to why the government should provide more funding to reform prisons into rehabilitation centers. The government should provide more funding in order to reform prisons into rehabilitation centers. Rehabilitation programs would be beneficial to the American taxpayers. In the same article, Brian Berkey wrote for Wharton UPenn in August 2017, The Economic Impact of Prison Rehabilitation Programs, Berkey also stated, with fewer people in prison, correctional facilities and less money. With fewer people in prison, correctional facilities need less money to operate, thus requiring less money from taxpayers. The American economy would prosper if taxpayers were required to pay less money towards prison operations, and the rehabilitated inmates would also be able to contribute to the economy. Next, we will explore foreign governments' success in decreasing incarceration rates. Foreign governments have seen a decrease in their incarceration rates. According to an article written in 2015 by Zishan Alim, a senior staff writer at Mike, Sweden's remarkable prison system has done what the US won't even consider. Alim states, in the past decade, the number of Swedish prisoners has dropped from 5,722 to 4,500, out of a population of 9.5 million. The country has closed a number of prisons, and the recidivism rate is around 40%, which is far less than the US and European countries. The decrease in the incarceration rate was after Sweden adopted a system of prisons. This decrease in incarceration rates was after Sweden adopted a system of prisons being about rehabilitation. Although there is a drastic difference in population size between the United States and Sweden, Sweden has created a pathway beneficial not only for its inmates, but also for its society, a pathway which the United States could follow. Professor Joanne Petersia's November 2012 article, Beyond the Prison Bubble, published by the National Institute of Justice, states, effective rehabilitation and re-entry programs that help the offenders go home and stay are good for them, and are good for the rest of us too. In conclusion, prisons should not serve as incarceration sites, but as rehabilitation centers. Current inmates are not receiving the necessary resources, which is why they continue to relapse back into their bad habits/tendencies or prison. In order to fix this increasing issue, the government should provide more funding in order to reform prisons into rehabilitation centers. Everyone deserves a second chance, and we as a society are responsible for providing the necessary resources for it to be possible. United, we are stronger.